The Book of Hosea, An Amazing Love Story. This class is titled, The Marriages of Hosea and Yahweh to Unfaithful Spouses.
But my goal this week is to take a look at the study of Hosea. I've always found this a very fascinating book in two respects. One, perhaps more than any other book, perhaps with the exception of the book of Psalms, it tells us a lot about the heart and the emotion of God. How he really feels about people, specifically sinners, his people, and how he goes about dealing with us. So it tells us a lot about God, and perhaps, even though we don't know a lot about Hosea and Gomer, perhaps we'll learn a lot more about ourselves. So my goal this week is to sort of to whet your appetite about the book of Hosea. The point being, and the goal being, that you go home and you crack open the book yourself and drill deeper. So today I'm going to give you sort of a backdrop, the context, if you will, of the time in which Hosea lived, what's going on in terms of the struggle between Yahweh and Baal, and what's going on in Israel, the challenges for the faithful remnant. We'll take a look, so today, at the allegory between the marriage of Hosea and Gomer and Yahweh and his people Israel, specifically largely focused on the northern kingdom. So tomorrow, and you'll have a homework assignment every night, so tonight your homework assignment is to read Hosea 4 and 5. So tomorrow we'll take a look sort of at the overriding basis of the case that Hosea and God present before Israel. It's an indictment, if you will. In the English King James, it'll say controversy or controversy. So we'll take a look at what's going on there. They've basically, as Mark Diliberto used to say, they folded like a cheap suit, and they've just basically they've forsaken God completely. So we'll take a look at that tomorrow. In class 3, we'll take a look at the impassioned pleas that he makes to them to repent. And irrespective of where they're at, he says, I'll have mercy and kindness and grace towards you if you just repent. And so he makes very impassioned pleas for them to repent. And so then, in light of the refusal to repent, he tells them in chapters 8, 9, and 10, here's what's going to happen. And then chapter 5, because the book's rather dark, and we'll take a look at that, there's golden nuggets and just brilliant rays of sunshine throughout the book, but it's pretty dark until you get to chapter 14, and it's just like, whoa. And just all of a sudden, God just rips open not only his heart, but just what he wants to accomplish with his people and how he's going to do it. So that's the goal this week, is to take a look at the amazing love story of Hosea, both in terms of Hosea as a man and what he does to win back Gomer. Most guys would say, look, I'm sorry, I'm out of here on this one. You've gone too far. And similarly, it's the relationship between God and Israel and how he rectifies and remedies that. And we'll take a look at that. So again, our breakdown, ultimately, the first 3 chapters is just the marriage between Hosea and Gomer. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of detail. So consequently, you'll get a lot of different various theories and perspectives. I'm not going to drill down too much on those theories. Largely, we're going to take a look at the relationship between God and Israel. That marriage, it was a marriage. And we're going to take a look at how he deals with making it better. So, let's just start at the beginning here. Hosea, very interesting name. It sort of gets butchered in translations. It's the same name as Joshua in the Old Testament, as well as Hosea, who was the last king of the northern kingdom of Israel. So he died about 30 years after Hosea. One and the same names. Interestingly, it's the same Hebrew root word for the name of Jesus. So in other words, Yahweh is salvation. And so that's the message that now Hosea is going to deliver to not only his wife Gomer, but ultimately to his countrymen. I'll say this right out from the get-go. This is my mea culpa. It's a very difficult book in some respects. Many expositors, commentators have a problem with the book. The text, above all others, is pretty difficult. And sometimes you'll run across verses like Hosea 11:12, Hosea 10:1. You'll get diametrically different translations. For instance, Hosea 11:12, Judah is faithful. Other versions will say Judah is totally unfaithful. Or Hosea 10:1, Israel's an empty vine in the King James. Other versions will say, most versions say it's a luxuriant vine. So there's a lot of words and phrases that translators had a problem with. So I'll give you some food for thought on that and help your studies there. But by and large, the interesting thing about the book of Hosea that really sort of resonates with a lot of people is the fact that this is a broken-hearted man, a broken-hearted God. Hosea 11 verse 8 is perhaps the singular verse in the Bible that really gives us an insight into the heart of God. He's not stoic. He's not indifferent. We learn a lot about the character of God and his love for his people through the book of Hosea. It really is written from the perspective of a broken heart. It's a very difficult book in some respects. We're coming at it, a few languages removed, and it's difficult for translators sometimes to put it in a language, and you find this with terms of proverbs from the Russian language or Arabic or Chinese or Spanish. Sometimes idioms and proverbs don't translate very well into English, and you're going to find that in the Hebrew. But we'll, again, be able to decipher this. Without an understanding, sort of like the guy sitting beside me on the plane, if you don't have a background of it, it seems rather nonsensical. It seems kind of random and sporadic. You're thinking, okay, what's the pattern here? It just seems like a steady stream of consciousness. So we'll take a look, basically, at the background of the knowledge of the times in the 8th century. So speaking of that, Jeroboam II was the king during the time of Hosea. He started reigning about 790. He reigned for 41 years. He was one of the longest reigning kings in both the north or the south. So Jeroboam started his reign. Jeroboam II started his reign about 170 years after Jeroboam I. No relation to them. He just happened to have that name. I'm not sure why his parents called him that. Because as you well know, Jeroboam I, he's the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. Not really a great name to name your kid. Elijah's about 60, 70 years before Jeroboam II or Hosea. And you recall, as Brother Christian's going to talk about a lot, what's going on at that time in history. It's a major contest, not just at Mount Carmel between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, the whole nation itself. He's just amazed that there seems to be nobody left, no brothers and sisters. God reminds them that there's 7,000 people who haven't bowed the knee to Baal. But that's a very infinitesimal portion of the population. So it was quite pervasive, the worship of Baal in this time in history. So in the 8th century, there's 4 contemporary prophets. There's Amos, whose focus was on justice. There's Hosea, who's counterbalanced justice and judgment with love and compassion and mercy, of how God resolves that seemingly inextricable contradiction between justice and mercy. How do you merge and meld the two together? Micah's got some rather sobering messages, but interspersed there is beautiful vignettes of both the king, the Messiah, and the kingdom. We all know that from Micah chapter 4 and Micah chapter 5. And then finally, the big one, Isaiah 66 chapters, deals with all of these same issues that all 3 of these deal with. And he's sort of at the tail end following these 3. So just to give you some geographical bearings, Hosea does most of his preaching, or it's directed towards the northern kingdom, whose capital was in Samaria. If you recall, after Jeroboam I, one of the worst kings they had was Omri. He establishes his kingdom in Samaria about right around the time of Elijah. And so Hosea comes along about 80 years after this. So a lot of his messages are directed towards Samaria. So the book is broken down into twofold portions. The first 3 chapters deal with the sort of the marriage, if you will, between Hosea and Gomer. The bulk of the book is prophetic in the sense of what's coming down the road. So again, he lived between 790 and 750 BC. What's important about that is because between 730 and 705 BC, the Assyrians come down 3 times, and it's horrific. It'd be analogous to the Russians or the Germans invading North America during World War II. That's what he's telling them. If you lived in England or whatever, you'd know just the backdrop of that it was pretty nerve-wracking to say the least. In fact, the warnings come to pass 3 times in the space of 30 years. This is the darkest period in Israel's history. This period here between the time Hosea prophesies, for 40 years. We get tired of doing stuff for 4 weeks, 4 months, 4 years. You imagine doing the same message over and over again for 40 years and no response, or worse? So after Jeroboam II dies, they go through a period of political instability. That basically in the space of 20 years they have 5 kings. Basically, there's a lot of conspiracy in as much as their army captains or chief of staff are basically plotting their murders. So a lot of political instability, and basically it becomes like the time of the judges. Everybody's just doing what's right in their own eyes. By the time the 7th century ends, during the time of King Hosea, Israel has become a military despotism. And religion has basically just become a very formal, cold, stoic, transactional basis of interaction with God. So whereas Amos, who's the first of the 8th century prophets, his focus is on justice, because even though they're living in a lap of luxury and opulence and affluence, they're doing it at the expense of the poor and the needy, the disenfranchised. So he's got scathing rebukes about the nation, what's going on. They're not loving their neighbor themselves, and consequently, if you read Amos chapter 8, for instance, you can see they're not even engaged at all with God. In contrast, Hosea, because a lot of the book is dealing with judgment, that justice is essential, but as we know from James, that mercy triumphs over judgment, and that's what we learn in the book of Hosea, that mercy ultimately triumphs over judgment, and that God overcomes the seemingly contradiction between justice and mercy in the pages of Hosea, and we see a good object lesson in the marriage between Hosea and Gomer. So the focus in Hosea is on faithfulness, love, and mercy above all. So it's interesting, I thought of this the other day, I'm thinking, it's when Jesus tells the Pharisees in Matthew 23, you guys have omitted the weightier matters of the law. And he enumerates faithfulness, justice, and mercy. Permeating all of this in both Hosea and Jesus' ministries is the message or the theme to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, not just lip service, but really mean it, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So the main problems going on in the 8th century during the time of Hosea is their unfaithfulness to God. That's obviously the marriage between Hosea and Gomer illustrates that. And you can well imagine if you're going through that situation, just a heartache, you'd have the whole plethora of different emotions from sadness, disappointment, anger, frustration. He experiences all of that. The interesting thing about him is you never really find out what he's thinking. He just basically either biographically or autobiographically jots down what happened factually. It's actually only through the pages of chapter 4 to 14, from God's perspective, we learn, this is how Hosea must have felt. So we find out in this particular case that it's basically everybody else out for themselves. Just what feels good, just do it. Doesn't matter about my husband, doesn't matter about my kids. Just do whatever you want to do. So ultimately, the main problem in the time of Hosea, the time from Elijah through this period in the 8th century, is the worship of Baal. It's pervasive, and we're going to take a look at what that meant. So the sad thing here is, in contradistinction to failing to love their neighbor, we see just how ugly sin becomes. They're not only arrogant, but they're ignorant. And that's the basis of his indictment in chapter 4, is that you are destroyed for lack of knowledge. You're ignorant about God, his laws, you've forgotten about them. And that indictment in chapter 4 is directed at the priesthood, whose main job and function was to teach people about God and to lead them from sin. So, this problem started all the way back during the time of the judges, so around 1400 BC. So it's been going on for about 600 years. And you can see in Judges, they forsook God and they served Baal and the Ashtaroths. They worshiped Baal in the 9th century. We see that. And then when Elijah comes around in 860, has that confrontation on Mount Carmel, he says, you got to make up your mind. You can't worship both Yahweh and Baal at the same time. If Yahweh's God, follow him. If Baal's the God, follow him. That's the struggle that's going on. And that's the struggle we see going on in the book of Hosea, is a struggle between Yahweh and Baal. And you're thinking, well, what's this got to do with the year 2018? I would submit to you, we've got the same issues. They come in different guises, but those same issues are true of every generation. We've all got to make a stand and make a choice and make a decision of who we're going to serve. So, if you just boiled it down to its essence in the book of Hosea, what's going on? Israel is now trusting in this stuff, in the armor of their flesh. They've fortified their palaces. They're very strong militarily. They've forged political alliances with everybody around them, all the way from Assyria to Egypt, thinking that would be their salvation, and they would live in peace and prosperity, and nothing bad would happen to them. They hedged their bets, but they placed all their money on the wrong entity, so to speak. The prophets come along. You got those 4 prophets, right? Amos, Micah, Hosea, and Isaiah. And they're exhorting Israel not to rely on the arm of the flesh, but to rely on God and to seek first His righteousness. And that's the uphill battle they're fighting for decades, not just a week or a month or a couple of years. We're talking actually hundreds of years. It's interesting, just in the span, the life cycle of nations, basically Israel had run its course. And typically you look at a lot of nations, usually they max out at about 250 years. Basically 3 full generations of 80 plus years per generation. Unfortunately, just human nature being what it is, that's what happens. And that's what happened with these guys. So, ironically, on the surface, if you're flying in United Airlines, flying over from a 30,000 foot view, it looks very prosperous. You read the book of Amos, they're sleeping on beds of ivory, they're eating lamb chops, prime rib. Life looks really good. But if you drill down and you start looking closer, it's a pretty ugly picture. And that's obviously what a lot of commentators note here, that it's a time of the oppression of the poor, moral declension, it's a spiritual degeneration, so much so that it's deemed to be appalling. And that's the climate, the moral climate in which Hosea is now confronting. So, a lot of parallels between his time and our time. We've all been blessed to live in this country, in the Western world, Western civilization. Generally speaking, since World War II in Vietnam, an era of prosperity for the last 40, 50 years. Peace and prosperity. A lot of material affluence. It's not that long ago in the big scheme of things in history when, your forebears were carrying around, chopping wood and going to the river to get water. It's only been in the last 100 years or so that we have so many new modern conventions. Life was tough. It's only in the last 100 years that we see how convenient it's become. Perhaps to our detriment, as we'll see. So what's interesting in Hosea's time, in spite of what they may see in terms of, it looks prosperous, but inside it was a time of moral decay and corruption. And you don't see that initially. When an apple corrupts or rots, you don't see it initially. You cut it open and you go, not too good. And that's what's going on here. And the main reason why was this last phrase right there, religious syncretism. Syncretism is a nice fancy way of saying it's a recipe, you just mix things, you add things. And that's what Jeroboam the first did, right? If you read 1 Kings 12, he just basically had a religion of syncretism, which was a religion of convenience and comfort. And he thought, when it's too far for you guys to go 30 miles, just come here to Dan or to Bethel. Don't bother about going to Jerusalem. So the parallels are quite stark, as we'll see. As one commentator put it, the interesting thing in the backdrop of just amazing opulence, you read Amos chapter 6 and you're going, whoa. But in the backdrop of that, he says it was a time in which it was characterized by selfishness, a lack of moral sense, and this is the key part, general indifference towards the needs of others. This was written 50 years ago, and the writer goes, the lesson of Israel needs to be remembered in this day and age. Obviously, perhaps not the oldest one here, you guys realize some of the changes and trends have happened in the last 50 years. So in spite of a time of peace and prosperity, it also is a time of rampant corruption and moral decay, like it was in Hosea's time. So Hosea comes along, and his message, because you read the first 13 chapters and you go, it's pretty heavy. And you think, because it's offset, you'll see it once you clue in and you see the pattern, oh, it's judgment, but it's always offset by restoration and mercy and grace. And God says, I'm going to pronounce judgments, but if you're humble and repentant, you're going to be on the right side of the equation here, and I will be gracious to you. So this writer made a very interesting observation. I think it captures the essence of God's perspective about Israel and just humanity at large here. The message of hope in Hosea's book reveals that harsh punishment, and it, along with that, is despair. You see a lot of that in Hosea. It's despair that's about to come. But he says, you know what? If we keep our trust in him, if we follow the Hezekiahs and the Isaiahs of the world, we have hope. And so it's offset. It's a message of hope, ultimately. And the interesting thing is that it paves the way for a rekindled romance. Because you can't build a marriage or a relationship on the basis of punishment, right? It might work for a couple days. To a Christian's point, you're not going to make a marriage out of that, right? So you need something more. You need hope. You need goodness and mercy. And we're going to see that. As this one quote says, that's what God is like. He says, you know what? I'm so patient. I'm going to make this work. And I'm going to make this a result. I'm going to rekindle this romance. So when you get to Hosea chapter 2, it's an amazing book. He's talking to his kids and said, hey, look, talk to your mother. Tell her what she's doing is wrong. And then it's pretty rough, the first 13 verses. Chapter 2, verse 14 to 23, it's like, whoa. It's an amazing turnaround, and it's basically predicated on divine grace. And we'll see that. Just the amazing promises that not only God makes to Israel, that perhaps he can imply that Hosea makes to Gomer. It's a remarkable turnaround, all predicated out of divine mercy and grace. So the book of Hosea is an interesting book just from a literary perspective. It's a fascinating book. It's chock full, especially from chapter 5 to 14, with a lot of metaphors, parables even. It's got a lot of what English scholar would call apposite epigrams. That's just a witty, clever saying. It's just an amazing book, so much so that there's about 40 similes in the book of Hosea. And they either are directed, they tell us something about God, or they tell us something about Israel. It's just fascinating study, just from a literary perspective, of how he communicates the message. So whether it's through fauna or flora, there's just replete, and we'll take a look at a lot of these different similes this week. Now, pay attention again, so they're similes, not metaphors, because God's not pantheistic. He's not equating himself with fruits or birds or calves, but he's saying, I'm like this. It's a simile, not a metaphor. And there are metaphors in the book of Hosea, and so most of the time they apply to Israel. A couple places they'll apply, actually all the metaphors apply to Israel. And so you can see sort of, again, we're dealing with people at different various stages of life or stations. So we'll take a look at a lot of these metaphors in Hosea. So many people in that time, if you read Micah chapter 6, just read it one fell swoop and read it in different versions, and it's quite troubling. Because in contrast to Genesis 18, Abraham's pleading with God just to spare Sodom and Gomorrah for the sake of his nephew. You read Micah chapter 6, they're totally indifferent to Micah's message, and they view religion strictly as a transactional basis. It's just business. And Micah is portraying God's perspective. He says, I just want these three things from you guys: to love mercy, justice, and walk humbly with your God. This isn't a business transaction. And so Hosea comes along, and he reminds them that the basis of true religion, and James picks this up in the New Testament, is relational, of how we treat one another and how we interact with God. It's not a business transaction, but rather it's relational. So, when speaking of relations, so we start in the book of Hosea. The first 3 chapters are very perplexing. If you look through literature over the last few hundred years, even go back to the Middle Ages, Hosea 1, 2, and 3, people have a hard time getting their head wrapped around the axle. Because if you read it like a Western person, just from a linear chronological perspective, it's like, can't make rhyme or reason of this. The Hebrews have a sort of form of voice that's called fluid personality. So chapter 2, it's in and out between Hosea and Gomer and God and Israel. And from verse to verse, or even sometimes within a verse, it's got that fluidity. So it's quite perplexing for people. The great perplexity is this. Why did God ask a man to go marry a woman like that? That's the question people wrestle with. He said, God asks a lot of hard things of people. With Ezekiel, you can't mourn the death of your wife. There's a lot of hard things that God asks people to do, but they're thinking, I think this might cross the line. But as you're going to see at the end of the week, it's interesting how he uses this model to basically pick out a bride even for his own son. You and I, we're Gentiles. If you follow the logic and the strain of thought in Corinthians, we were all not in a good place at one point in time. And yet God, through his grace and mercy and holiness, is able to convert and transform sinners into saints and make something beautiful, to make a bride for his son. It's an amazing transformation. That's the true story of the beauty of the beast, is how God can make something so ugly into something so beautiful and then present to his son. So we'll take a look at how this conundrum is perhaps solved. But from chapters 1 to 3, these are the 5 main sections. There's rejection. And we see that happening with Hosea and Gomer. We see restoration on the basis of a covenant, a new covenant he's going to make with them. Chapter 2. The end of chapter 1. Chapter 2, the first part, it's pretty stern, the rebuke that's given because of Israel's infidelity. Chapter 2, last part of it, is just a beautiful promise of restoration and renewal. And then finally, we see that little snippet in 81 words, in 5 verses, in chapter 3, we see how God, through the example of Hosea and Gomer, can reconcile and redeem sinners. It's an amazing picture. So again, 3 major breakouts, 1 to 3, we've already seen that. The example of what's going on in the land. Basically the worship of Baal, and consequently what's happening. Each of the sections always ends with a promise of return. So chapter 3, verse 5 ends with the children of Israel returning. They'll leave home, but there's a promise to come back home. The second section, chapter 4 to 11, God's got an indictment, a controversy. He's got a case. He's got a problem because there's no faithfulness, mercy, or knowledge of God in the land. That section in chapter 11 ends with they're going to return to their homes. Similarly, in chapter 12 through 14, he now directs, in chapter 12, his focus on Judah. And he says, God's got an indictment or controversy against you guys. Don't fall into the same trap that Israel has. And again, ultimately the book ends with the same promise to return and to live under his protection. Those are very high-level concepts and chapter breakdowns, section breakdowns. So here's the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, and looking at the book of Hosea. There's 5 cycles of judgment and restoration. Until you sort of dial into this, you're thinking, it seems kind of chaotic and haphazard. You're thinking, there's no rhyme or reason, like I'm going from this verse to that verse. You step back for a minute and you look at the structure. It's the beauty of the Hebrew language. There's a lot of structure and symmetry here, and there's 5 cycles. It always starts off with judgment. God, that's not the last word. And the last word is mercy and grace. And he gives them promises of restoration in each one of these 5 cycles. So at your own leisure, you can take a look at that. So, chapter 3. If we take a look at this the way a lot of people do, not necessarily everybody, he's asked to go. Gomer's left for a while. God says, I want you to go marry her, love her again, and take her to be your wife again. And after you read chapter 2, you're thinking, I don't see how that could happen. And you can imagine, this is over the course of a long period of time. They have 3 children, as we're going to see in a second. And it's implied quite strongly that they're probably young 20s by the time he has the discourse with them. So we're talking about a long period of time. And you can well imagine, the stigma that comes with a person in this situation. Oh, Hosea, how about your wife? He would have heard stuff every day of his life. The shame and the public disgrace must have been just burning anguish to a sensitive heart of a godly man. And now he's got a wife whose favorite thing is to love cakes of raisins and to go to the temple and to serve in the temple of Baal. For a man of God, no less a man of God, but a prophet of God, this must have just been scandalous. And to have to live through this situation for a long period of time, and then to get that command in chapter 3, and there's no bartering thing. Really, I think I've done enough already. He does it. He trudges down there, knocks on the guy's door. It's implied he's probably not too rich. He gives him 15 shekels of silver and 5 bushels of barley. Everything he's got to redeem his wife. And, there's no Uber. So you've got to turn around and walk back home. And I'm sure people are just making cat calls and looking out the window and thinking, oh, what's going on there? So we see, I think you can extrapolate the type of man that he was to rise above the situation and to love his wife. So again, if you read chapter 1 and chapter 3, people reconcile with that. I think the solution is perhaps those chapters are written at different points in time in his life. So we'll take a look, and I can talk about that offline. So again, it's interesting that the divine directive comes in chapter 1, verse 2. Go take yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom. So he's got 3 children, Jezreel, Lo-ruhamah, and Lo-ammi. So chapter 2, verse 4 and 5, we can see from that they were children of adultery. It states that explicitly. So he's told in advance, you're going to marry this woman, whether she was a prostitute at that time or a cultic prostitute or later, whatever. At some point in time, there's going to be a dramatic turn here, and she's going to have children, and at least 2 of them are going to be born out of wedlock or out of their marriage. And he says, this is representative of the great spiritual harlotry that's happening in my land right now. So from a human perspective, we want more detail from chapters 1 to 3. Earlier from the divine perspective is, this isn't a harlequin romance. I don't want to get too wrapped up in this. The main point of this is the real message is the relationship between God and Israel. And so that's the focus we'll take this week. So the interesting thing about Hosea, he's not only the messenger, he's the message. So chapter 1 to 3, we see that played out, that allegory, if you will, the marriage between Hosea and Gomer and the 3 children. And what happens there? It serves as a platform for prophetic message Israelites not only had to hear, they needed to hear. And the point is this. They would have seen Gomer, and they would have seen the 3 children. Who names their children Jezreel, Lo-ruhamah, and Lo-ammi? One writer says, the naming of Jezreel, that's like naming your son Waterloo or Verdun, or more modern terms like Fallujah. Like, what the heck? What's that name mean? Why would you name your kid that? Again, it was supposed to be a stark reminder to them, this is a prophetic message. Me and my family are serving to you as a macro, as a whole. So, just to get our facts straight here, from God's perspective, they were married. You see that in Jeremiah 31, verse 32. They made a covenant. You guys broke it. I was your husband. You get some time. These are the 8 stages of a Jewish marriage in Old Testament period, and it's enumerated in the book of Exodus, largely chapter 24. They go through all those stages. They had a wedding, if you will. They were married. And so that's the point when you get to the book of Hosea. God says, you've now been totally unfaithful to the covenant you made with me. So that's the basic breakdown. The natural sort of parable, if you will, is the relationship between Hosea and Gomer. And the spiritual fulfillment of that is the marriage between God and Israel. They were married. And so you can see the essence of why he was heartbroken and upset. So here's the family tree. Hosea is the son of Beri. Gomer's the daughter of Diblaim. Most people believe that was male. Some people believe it was a female. The reason being the phrase double layers of grape cake. She was the daughter of basically a Baal worshiper. And some people think that she sort of learned her ways from her mother. I'm not committal either way, but if you do read commentaries, etc., you'll get a little different perspective on who Diblaim was. So again, you see the significance of the name. For Gomer, names mean complete. And you're thinking, that's weird. I think the implication is she was completely given over to Baal worship. And now Hosea, just like God does with us, to save us from idolatry. You read 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 9. That was true of first century Christians, to turn from idols unto the living God. I would submit that over every generation, that's what happens with all of us. We turn from serving idols, whatever they may be. Because ultimately, idol worship is the serving, taking a good thing and making it the ultimate thing. That's idolatry. And that can happen on anything that's basically inherently all right. It's good. But we make it the ultimate thing. And ultimately, I think all of us perhaps are idol worshipers in a former time. So again, these are the three children, what their names mean. And you think, you imagine naming your daughter no love, no mercy, no pity. I mean, those are stark names. And it was meant to trouble them and say, look, we're not in a good way here. It's affecting everyone, both me and my wife, the kids, society at large. But from that, he pulls out some wonderful prophecies about what God's going to do, to show love to people who are not my people or loved ones. People who weren't his people are now going to be his people, and he's going to be our God. This verse is Hosea 2:23 is quoted in the New Testament as applying to you and I, Gentiles coming into the family of God. Chapter 1 ends with the promises. It says, yet the number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in a place where it's said to them, you are not my people, it should be said to them, children of the living God. So again, these promises are reiterated to Abraham all the way through the Bible. That's the thread, that the nations of the earth will be blessed through the promised seed of Abraham. And you and I are fortunate to be with that. And he reminds Hosea and his family, that's what God has in store. In spite of what it looks like right now, I can transform this. So at this point, it's not only the darkest period in their history, it's perhaps the most idolatrous period in their history. They're given over to spiritual harlotry and prostitution. The amazing thing here is, from sort of an orthodox perspective, the penalty for idolatry in Deuteronomy 22:22, Leviticus 20:10 was death. At a minimum, you think, oh, well, I'm just leaving you. God doesn't solve problems half-heartedly, right? You read Hosea chapter 2, he's seeking all means and ways to avoid this, but ultimately his whole hope and goal and purpose is to redeem her and have her return home, to resolve the problem. And that's we see in chapter 2, the time would come when she said, you know what, I'm going to go back to my husband at first. I was better off then. This is a story of the prodigal daughter. In the New Testament, we see the story of the prodigal son. This is the prodigal daughter, Gomer, going back home because it's better there. So in Hosea chapter 2, God said, you know what, I'm going to visit upon her the days of Balaam, when she burned incense to them, decked herself with earrings and jewels. She went after her lovers. The key point, she forgot me. And he says, even though you forget about me, I haven't forgotten about you, and I'm going to solve this. We saw that. The main principle here is you can't have it both ways. You can't have two masters. You can't have two husbands. So make your mind up. So we see that even at this point in history, at the end of the 8th century, when the Assyrians come in, they transplace and displace people and move people around. They brought in the Samaritans, and they had the problem. They tried to worship Yahweh and serve their idols at the same time. That's the problem in the 8th century, trying to do both. And God says, that's not going to cut it. So you can see a little bit of the perspective of not only Gomer, but perhaps of Israel. She says, and notice the pronouns here, I will go after my lovers, who gave me my food, and my water, my wool, my linen, my olive oil, my drink. No recognition or appreciation that it's God, Yahweh, who gave, in this case, Hosea, who gave her all this and provided for her. Israel, the God, gave him that. There's no acknowledgement of that. And that's what he says in verse 8, chapter 2. She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine, the oil, who lavished on her silver and gold. What did they do with them? What did she do with it? Anything Hosea gave her, she took it and gave it to Baal. You imagine giving your wife beautiful gifts and turn around and give it to the guy next door? You can imagine how God would have felt. So here's the amazing thing in the book of Hosea chapter 2, verse 14. Here's the phrase. It says, I will allure her. You look that word up. how it's used elsewhere? It's translated as seduce, to speak intimately with. It's very strong, powerful in the Hebrew language. Verbs are everything. And that's the verb here. I will allure her. I will speak unto her in the wilderness and speak kindly to her or comfortably. And I will give her vineyards. And from the valley of Achor is a door of hope. The valley of Achor. What happened there? Achan, remember after they just defeated Jericho? And he just buries the stuff that he wants? It was the valley of Achor translated as the valley of trouble, the valley of despair and calamity. And God says, you know what? I can change things that are, if you're in the pit of despair and calamity and thinking, you know what, life is hopeless, where do I go from here? He says, you know what? I can open a door for you. And here's the remarkable transformation. If you didn't know your Bible, you're thinking, what the heck is he talking about? He's saying, I'm going to take you from a valley of despair and trouble, a valley of sin, and I'm going to bring it in. And you see in Isaiah 65 verse 10, you're going to lie in pastures in the valley of Achor. It says, and she will sing there as in the days of her youth, in the day that she came up from the land of Egypt. As one writer said, you know what, at this point in the book, because if you read chapter 2, verses 1 to 13, you're thinking, oh, what's going to happen here? And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it's the paradox of divine grace, because you're thinking, the hammer's coming down for the third time here in chapter 2. This is the last pronouncement of judgment, 3 strikes and you're out. And all of a sudden, God says, you know, I'm going to allure her. I'm going to speak comfortably to her or to her heart. I'm going to win her back. So in contrast to that, it says, the day's coming, you're no longer going to call me Baal. You're going to know me on an intimate basis, on a first name basis. So here's the point for you and me. We all have wilderness experiences. I guarantee every one of you, me, we've all had wilderness experiences. You read Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 16. The wilderness wasn't a good place to be, right? Scorpions, snakes, no water. That's what it feels sometimes in life. You feel abandoned. You feel maybe distant. We all have to go. Nobody got spared. Moses and Joshua, they didn't get spared. Everybody's got to go through a wilderness of life. And Hosea says, that's at the end of Hosea in chapter 2, that's where God comes back to win his case, Gomer, but where God comes back to win all of us. He will take us through that wilderness and bring us into a promised land. And it's here in chapter 2, specifically verse 19 and 20. He gives 5 promises. And he says, I'm going to betroth unto you in righteousness, in justice, love, mercy, and faithfulness. 5 beautiful promises. It's only the groom who makes promises here. But there's some of the greatest weighted promises we see in all of the Bible. It tells us a lot about who God is. Because ultimately, He's and His Son, the groom. These are the promises that they make to you and me. They allure us back out of the wilderness, speak comfortably or kindly to us, and give us wonderful promises. It's those promises in verse 19 and 20. That's God says, you know what? And think about it. This is to Gomer. He says, we're going to work this out, and we're going to renew our marriage vows, if you will. And this is going to be in the basis of our relationship. It's the same basis that God has with you and I. These are great and precious promises. This isn't just dry, musty history. I'm not flying halfway across the country or all across the country to read dry, dusty history. This stuff is meaningful. It changes our lives and it gives us hope in spite of the despair of being in a wilderness. That, we got to keep going. We got to keep walking. As Christian mentioned this morning, you can't stay put. You got to keep moving. We all can identify with the end of the book of Revelation chapter 21. Because it doesn't matter who you are, how much money you have, how smart you are, how strong you are, how successful in life you are, whatever. We all shed tears sooner or later. And God gives us the promise there will be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. All these things will be gone. We're reassured by real promises predicated because God is faithful. And so finally, that's the promise that's reiterated in the New Testament. That you and I, who are Gentiles, from a Jewish perspective, you and I are dogs. We don't deserve to be in the same room, perhaps. They had it wrong, perhaps some people who had that interpretation. But God says, you know what? They're wrong. I'm going to redeem you, and you're going to be my people, and I'm going to have mercy on you. And that's how chapter 2 in Hosea ends, with blessings of a new covenant, nature restored, if you will, and mercy, and people are productive, and ultimately people who become his people. That's the promise that Hosea makes to Gomer. That's the promise that God makes to Israel. That's the promise that he makes to you and I. So in chapter 3, this is the process that they go through. It's remarkable. In 81 words, and actually even less than that, he sums up how he solves the problem. So that's chapter 3, verse. About 35 years ago, I started working on a history of Israel. I wanted to prove to my family and friends that God existed. And I think I'm 1,600 pages into it. And I thought, Hosea does this in 81 words. That's the beauty of Scripture, and its simplicity cuts to the heart of it. I'm thinking, it's amazing what he does in verse 4. This is going to be your history, and how he does it. And ultimately, how he's going to solve the problem. And David in Hebrew has the connotation of beloved. The Messiah, the son of David, they're going to seek him and his father, and they're going to fear him and his goodness in the latter days. So as one writer said in Latin, this is multum in parvo. It's very much in a little space. 81 words, 5 verses, you got the whole history of Israel. So go back when you get a chance, just meditate and cogitate on that. It's phenomenal what he was able to encapsulate in that few verses. I got 5 minutes left and I'm going to make it. So again, we saw in chapter 3, verse 1, he redeems her. He buys her for 15 shekels of silver and 5 bushels of barley. And he says, okay, here's how we're going to make this work. Obviously, you've gone off the rails here. You live with a lot of different men. You're going to come home, live with me for many days. You must not be a prostitute or intimate with any man. And I promise you, I'm going to behave the same way. It's interesting. Barley was the food fit for beasts. It was basically the food of poor people. She's reached the point now, she's actually even less than the cost of a slave. Gored to death by a bull. Sin does that to us. It just cheapens us and it reduces our value. But God says, you know what? I can redeem this. And I'm going to bring you into my house. And you're going to live with me. And I'm going to show you a better way. And that's what happens here. As one writer put it, it's the locus classicus. It's the solution that's presented in Hosea 3, how God solves the problem of someone who's become very sinful, exceedingly sinful. How does God solve that problem? Well, it's interesting what he does. He brings her back into his house. He didn't leave her out in the back shed, the back 40. He says, you're coming back into the house. This is how God wanted to treat Israel. This is how we're to model our relationships based on compassion and forgiveness. Grace will always abound over sin. It'll always triumph over it. James makes that argument. Mercy will always triumph over judgment. And we see how it's done in the book of Hosea. And you'll see it this week. You'll notice in Hosea, in chapter 1, he says, go and take to yourself Gomer, a wife of whoredom. Chapter 3, verse 1, go love a woman who's loved by another man as an adulteress. Nowhere does he say, go divorce her. He says, Hosea says, God says to him, you got to go marry her again, love her again. Most people think that's too much. You're asking way too much of me. But Jesus does the same thing when it comes 750 years later. People who are publicans, who are prostitutes and sinners, somehow through the touch of the Master, he's able to transform people into being sinners into saints. So here's the amazing thing, because we're in the middle of the law of Moses here, smack dab in the middle. It was 700 years after Moses gave it. Gomer merited the sentence of death. God, if he just kept true to the letter of the law, that would have been it for her. But Hosea, God himself's not even bound by the law, not even his own law. In this case, he shows mercy. That's the whole point that is given time and time again, whether it's in Exodus or Romans. I will show mercy to whom I will show mercy. It's his prerogative to show mercy to whom he will. Whether it's a King David who should have been killed, committed a murder and adultery. So we learn something in the book of Hosea, that grace is something vastly different than law. If we just want to live by law, the argument goes, then go try it. James says in chapter 2, verse 10, if you're guilty of one point of the law, you're guilty of what? The whole thing. So if we really want to play that game and have that kind of ledger, God says, well, go for it and see how well you do. We've got a different and a better model here through that's what Paul makes that argument over and over again in the New Testament. Grace is better. It's a better covenant that we have. So we'll end with this thought. He had to redeem his wife with 15 shekels of silver and 5 bushels of barley. Jesus comes along. He says, in the writer's state, he's redeemed us with something even greater than silver and gold. It's not just 5 bushels of barley. He gives his life for his bride. He redeems her when most people said, look, I'm not sure what you're doing there. That's the hope that we have, that we have someone who loves us so much in spite of our sin. He says, I love you so much, I'm going to lay down my life for you. You're my friends now. And ultimately to be his bridegroom. It's an amazing message in contrast to Hosea. It's the fulfillment of Hosea and his relationship with Gomer. So tomorrow, we're going to turn the corner, if you will. So your homework is to read Hosea 4 and 5. And that Old English word, controversy or controversy, and actually literally in Hebrew it's riv, R-I-V, it means lawsuit. And God says, I got a lawsuit because you got 3 things you guys are missing. Faithfulness, mercy, and you have no knowledge of God. And so we'll dig deeper into that tomorrow and see why he was heartbroken. And so we'll take a look at that tomorrow, Hosea 4 and 5. Thank you.